Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about one of my favorite periods and schools, and that is the Bauhaus. It is chapter 13. Just a note, we're skipping chapter 12. We're doing 13, which is Bauhaus today, and tomorrow we're doing chapter 14, which is Surrealism. So some really fun stuff to study and to talk about. So the Bauhaus is a school and it's very influential in its teaching, but I think we have to back up a bit before we talk about how influential the Bauhaus was as a school. You'll notice the first question is, from your perspective, how would you describe a distinction of fine art and craft? So before we even talk about anything, I want you to answer that question, and then we'll address how the Bauhaus takes a look at art differently. So before we talk about how influential the Bauhaus is, we have to back up and talk about how art schools and art academies ran prior to the Bauhaus. So typically, like a French academy like this, the Beaux Arts, which was a really important school, generally taught a distinction between fine art. You either did painting, drawing, or architecture at those schools, and those were the fine arts. You didn't do printmaking or ceramics or photography or textile, because that was seen as a craft, and that would be taught at a different school, a school for decorative arts. So here on the left you can see a photograph of a 19th century French academy, the Beaux Arts, the School of the Beaux Arts, and you can see first of all what stands out to you. It's all dudes, right? It's all men. We've talked about many women this semester already in modern art who were denied entrance from the art academies and had to the official sponsored, state-sponsored schools in France, in Germany, and other places in England, and they had to instead enroll in art schools that accepted men and women. Generally were decorative arts, where they would focus on things like ceramics, jewelry, textiles, as opposed to what was the distinction of fine art, which creates a hierarchy, right? It says painting and drawing is better than printmaking and more decorative arts, like even murals, for instance, right? So this is an interesting distinction. The Bauhaus says, though, why do we need to, the other thing you can notice from this photograph is it's men drawing a nude model. And up until the early 20th century, that was a pretty staid tradition, right? So even if a person was going to draw and paint women like Manet, they had to hire their own model, and they weren't taught that way in schools. They taught how to draw the male nude because that was more socially acceptable. And hence you can see some of the controversy surrounding Le Déjeuner and also Manet's Olympia, the luncheon on the grass in Olympia, because of the shocking presentation of nudity. Think about artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo, who had to draw cadavers to understand anatomy. So the French Academy created a solution for that, but still primarily drawing the male nude and also not allowing women to study, right? All men in this picture, all men in this photograph. And what the Bauhaus does is says, who even cares necessarily about drawing the nude model? If you think about Matisse and Picasso at the turn of the century, they're experimenting with Cubism. They're looking at art from Africa, art from the Cycladic Islands, like Modigliani, who we talked about in the last chapter, for inspiration. And it doesn't have to even be from direct observation. So if art is changing, shouldn't the academies change? And so the Bauhaus was very progressive in that sense. First of all, you see in this picture on the left a great photograph of a classroom in the Bauhaus. It was more about materials and play, and no distinction between different materials or different mediums. And also integrating the students who would have normally said they were artists, or the students normally that would have said they were designers or craftspeople. They were all integrated as one. So there was no distinction. And if you were an architect, if you were training to be an architect, you still took the same classes that focused on materials that a textile student would, or a drawing student, or a painting student was. So there was no distinction, no hierarchy. Actually, there still was a hierarchy, but it was trying to break down the hierarchies that came before it. Because honestly, if all of a sudden you have abstraction, if you have modernism, the school would need to shift, would need to change. So the Weimar Republic is really tied to the Bauhaus. 1918 is a really important date. It's after the end of World War I. It's the start of Weimar, the Republic in Germany, in post-war Germany, and Weimar is the capital of this Weimar Republic. So this is the town in Germany where the Bauhaus school started, and you can see here, this is a really early publication, 1923, and it says Weimar. It later shifts and moves to a different city in Dessau, which we'll talk about. But very influential school, started in 1918 by Walter Gropius. And it had been an earlier applied arts school as opposed to a fine arts school prior to 1918. And Walter Gropius, the original director, changed the way that the school ran, creating an opportunity for men and women from many different socioeconomic backgrounds, which would have been very progressive for the time as well. Didn't matter if you were rich, wealthy, lower class, boom, you had the opportunity to study, which was a tradition later that in the United States, the academy and colleges creates an opportunity much later, not immediately, but is influenced by Bauhaus in that sense as well. So Bauhaus, like I mentioned, literally means house of building. And so to focus, remember I said there's not really a hierarchy, still they saw the purest distillation of art being in architecture. So if you understood painting, you could become an architect. You could understand basically how color and form works. Boom, you could be an architect. And to talk about Bauhaus, I think we have to talk about Walter Gropius first. Walter Gropius studied under Peter Behrens, and remember we looked at that really important building that that Peter Behrens had done, that factory. Let's hold it up here. So Walter Gropius studied under Peter Behrens. He also, this turbine factory, had this idea of architecture could benefit society, and you can see a direct connection between Peter Behrens and Walter Gropius. Walter Gropius becomes very influential in his experiments in architecture. So even before he was the director, the first director of the Bauhaus School, which he was the director for 10 years, from 1918 to 1928, he was an architect before that, and still in the early years of him being the director of Bauhaus, he still continued to have his private practice and continue to practice his building of really innovative structures. So this is the Fagus shoe factory, and you can see one thing that he does is, because it's a factory and kind of based on some of those ideas of Peter Behrens, that things should be light, things should be airy, a dedication to lightness, okay? Two aspects of that, a dedication to lightness. So the materials themselves will feel light, but also this building feels light, but also secondly, it allows the person working in this space to appreciate the light. So it doesn't have to be a dark, gloomy factory. It can have an inspirational quality to it. He develops something that becomes known as the curtain wall. If you think about traditional post and lintel construction essentially means you have two vertical supports and a horizontal beam across that. This is known also as load-bearing construction. If y'all love architecture, you should take my history of architecture class that I'm going to be teaching in the fall, and we go into more in depth about some of these aspects. But this is essentially, I mean, this is Stonehenge right here. This is a very ancient type of architecture, but you were limited by the ability to span a wall, that is the space between walls and how large your ceiling could be, based on the weight and how much post and lintel you had. In other words, it was difficult to spread these out. that became dangerous to spread it out too far. But with the innovations of cement architecture and steel beam architecture, now all of a sudden you could have great, huge open spans that you couldn't before. And with post and lintel construction, basically a glass window had to be supported by post and lintels. But instead, with a curtain wall, what it does, it's just like the name implies. The glass literally becomes a curtain. And instead of building it from the floor up, it hangs from the ceiling, hence the name curtain wall. The glass, in other words, is suspended from the weight of the roof above it or the floor above it, as opposed to having to be supported from underneath. So it's a brilliant innovation engineering-wise, but it also allows a lot more light to come through. And I love this corner. Look at the corner here. Walter Gropius is able to figure out a way of having an unobstructed view with a really, really small section supporting that glass curtain wall. You don't need a beam. You don't need brick on this corner. It's just the metal sheathing and the glass that's applied to it that's holding that structure together. Very, very brilliant, beautiful, and innovative. So Walter Gropius really believed in this idea of functionalism, i.e. that the building should kind of suit the use that it's intended for, right? And his buildings, with this functionalism came a certain aesthetic. This actually influences later skyscrapers as well. Skyscrapers could be minimalist, but also still pleasing to the eye and suit the purpose of the building, functionalism. And that's really a major tenet of this school of Bauhaus. So he organized the school in order to train architects and to train artists. One of the things that's really interesting about Walter Gropius is he wasn't really good at drawing. Most architects, if you think about it, they would start with a drawing, create a model, and then the building is based on the model. But Walter Gropius was more of an ideas guy. He said, someone else can do the architectural drawing for me. I'm going to come up with the idea for the building. That's more important. So in other words, he could just loosely sketch it out, kind of construct a model, a building that's going to become a building, right? So think about the craft of that. And that becomes really influential in the teaching of Bauhaus as well. Think about the material, think about the space, think about the craft of the building versus necessarily think about having to draw it out in advance. And so this frees up the idea of architecture entirely and the idea of pure form. So Walter Gropius moved the school of Bauhaus from Weimar to Dessau. Dessau is a more industrial location, so he moves it in 1925. At the same time, to be able to focus on the school, he closed his architectural practice at that time as well. So from 1918 to about 1924, the Bauhaus was in Weimar, a small, beautiful little town in Germany. But now it's in Dessau, which is much more industrial and also politically more progressive. So he doesn't have to worry about how people are going to view and make judgments on his new way of teaching, this new school, which became very influential. Let me read this statement. This is a proclamation of the Bauhaus early on. And Walter Gropius said this: architects, painters, and sculptors must recognize anew the composite character of a building as an entity. Art is not a profession. There is no essential difference between artists and the craftsman. The artist is an exalted craftsman. Together let us conceive and create the new building of the future, which you can kind of see here, which will embrace architecture and sculpture and painting in one unity, and which will rise one day toward heaven from the hands of a million workers, like the crystal symbol, like this, of a new faith, which sounds very idealistic and esoteric, that he's talking about, working together towards raising this up for a symbol of a new faith. But essentially what he's doing is saying, think about during medieval times, there was no distinction between painting and sculpture and craft art, because the stone workers who would work on the Gothic buildings, had to also work with the people who were doing stained glass, which at this time would have been considered a decorative art and not a fine art. And he's saying, let's go back to the medieval era where they were building huge buildings with a new faith, a new idealism that built huge buildings towards the skies. And essentially you get the same idea with modernity. Instead of Gothic architecture, you now have the idealism of modernism, which eventually becomes very international in scope and creates skyscrapers, etc. But this was very foundational. It's interesting, though, because we talk about how he had hoped to eradicate the distinction between fine art and decorative arts, but he's still saying architects, painters, and sculptors, right? And he's saying art is not a profession. There is no difference between artists and craftsmen, yet he's still saying painting and sculpture, which we're seeing as kind of the top hierarchy. So it's hard to break down those barriers overnight. If you think about an artist like Katie Kollwitz, who was a printmaker, not necessarily by choice, but because that was what was afforded women at the time in Germany to go study decorative arts instead of fine arts. And so we see this sort of distinction. This is the workshop wing of the Bauhaus. This has been reconstructed. This is how it originally looked. It had to be reconstructed. Walter Gropius designed this. And it's cool because to me it really looks like abstract compositions. We skipped chapter 12, but this is a piece by Pete Mondrian, and it looks very much like De Stijl or De Stijl abstract compositions. Here we can see the curtain wall, but it's this sheathing that's outside. Really beautiful architecture, very innovative, that becomes kind of industry standard. So one thing to think about, Bauhaus founded as a school of ideals of the arts and crafts movement that we've talked about before, like William Morris and others. Frank Lloyd Wright was inspired by that as well at the turn of the century. And in Belgium, when they were practicing Art Nouveau, and in France, that this was a distillation of those ideas. So there was precedences. Slowly, little by little, people were trying to make these change, but ultimately the Bauhaus was able to codify these and create a really consistent pedagogy and curriculum built upon breaking apart the barriers of fine arts and craft. One of the things that was really innovative too is they had instructors coming from different backgrounds, so painters, sculptors, architects. They were influenced by constructivism in Russia. Artists like Malevich and Lissitzky and Kandinsky, who we had talked about before. And each course, each class would have two instructors, one focusing on the craft, i.e. how it's made, the sort of technique of it, and one who would focus on the form, how it looked, how it was visually pleasing. So it's a really interesting distinction how they would emphasize craft, how well it was made, but also form, how it would look. Very, very innovative. We're going to talk about some of these innovative teachers, okay? So an early teacher at Bauhaus was Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. That's how you pronounce his name. And he was really interested in light and space and motion. He dabbled in a lot of different mediums. Gone was this idea that you were just trained as a painter or a sculptor or as an architect. You could understand the principles of any of those and be able to carry out your art in any different medium. I love that idea. I love that concept. He was one of the first artists to really explore kinetic sculpture, thinking about modernism, thinking about machines. And it's cool because Walter Gropius felt that architects should understand engineering, which was new at the time, and now is like a formal foundation of architecture school, that you would understand engineering. Otherwise, you would never be able to create something like a curtain wall. You would imagine it, and then you would hand it over to an engineer, and they would figure out how to actually build it. In a way, Walter Gropius and these other teachers are saying, you should understand the design aspects, but you should understand the construction, the actual building aspects as well. Which, Walter Gropius is thinking about all of the aspects, right, of a building and of art, the things that feed together. And it's interesting too, because in Bauhaus, they thought about the interior space as well, like what you put inside of it, which we'll talk about as well. So he created what he called these light modulators, these sculptures that would spin and light up and reflect and cast light and shadows on the wall and the space around them. So in that sense, art could become much more immersive and in a way interactive, because you would experience this sculpture not just visually how you looked at it, but also in a sensory way, how it would play off of the space in the room where it's located as it's casting different shadows and different lights. So it's kinetic, it has the ability to move, which has been a consideration in art for centuries, but now with modernism, with new innovations in terms of machines, there is now a way to actually produce movement in art. Laszlo Moholy-Nagy was also in different mediums like sculpture, photography, and it's interesting because he innovated this cameraless photograph technique the same way that Man Ray did, that we just talked about with his rayograms. But unfortunately, the name rayograms never really stuck. Sorry, Man Ray. And instead, we now call these photograms based on the ideas of Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. They independently, in two separate locations, Man Ray, first in Philadelphia and in New York, and Laszlo Moholy-Nagy in Dessau, creating these two independent ideas of how to incorporate objects on a photograph as it's being developed, right? So basically what you can do is you have a piece of photo paper, and instead of exposing it to a negative that you shot in a camera, you just put objects on top of it, flash light on it, and in some cases he would animate these with his light modulators like this, and so it would have more of a sense of light and space and motion, which is really those three factors is what he explores in his art all the time. So really interesting. These are called photograms. I don't know if you've had a class with Ian or if you've taken a photo class and you've had an opportunity to make photograms before, but they're really, really interesting because, you know, if you take something that's three-dimensional and you set it on the paper, it loses that 3D sense of height and you only get its silhouette or its footprint of where it was. So it kind of creates this mystery of what we're looking at. Basically, you know, thinking about the theories of abstraction and different ways of visualizing, the photograph could do the same thing. So kind of an abstract photography. Another influential teacher, and one that's very inspirational and near and dear to my heart, is the artist Joseph Albers. Joseph Albers, so I didn't mention this, but Laszlo Moholy-Nagy was Hungarian, and he left Hungary to go to Germany, and then that later he interacted with some artists in Berlin, like El Lissitzky, Kurt Schwitters, who we talked about before, who did Merzbau. Joseph Albers is German. Joseph Albers started at Bauhaus as a student in 1920, and by 1923 was appointed to the faculty. Wow, that was a quick transition, right? Imagine you as a student started at Lyon College in 2020, and by 2023, you're a professor. That's not quite how it works, right? There's kind of a step between graduating and then teaching at your own institution. But they respected his work. He married a woman named Annie Fleshman, who becomes Annie Albers, and her work is all about textiles. And remember that we're breaking down those hierarchies and boundaries of men and women being in the same space and in learning, and so it was a very influential. Annie Albers and Joseph Albers were very influential at Bauhaus. Joseph Albers taught classes about form. He also taught some furniture design classes and some glass classes. So this is an example of a colored glass piece that he made, which was a beautiful study about harmony and rhythm. And in the United States, he had the opportunity to create a huge glass mural in the New York MetLife building, which was a 54-foot wide mural that has this same kind of glass process that he developed and invented, where he basically sandblasted and fused glass, created a way of pigmenting it and fusing it together to create these beautiful color juxtapositions. So think about too, like in the Gothic tradition, that stained glass was important, but in the fine art tradition, in the French academies, the German art schools, that had been relegated to a different school, a lesser, had less funding, not as important teachers or students going to it. And here at the Bauhaus, we're saying all of these things are important. So he also taught a class that was called Vorkurs, Vorkurs, which means foundations. And another artist, Johannes Itten, also taught that class. And basically what it was a crash course into color, composition, and form. Today we call this foundations. Vorkurs means foundations. And it basically is a class like 2D design, which is one of my first classes. It's the first class I ever taught, one of my favorite classes taught. And I'm indebted to Joseph Elbers and Itten and their ideas about how to teach a class like foundations, which we now call 2D design or 3D design, or even some of the elements in a drawing one class. So he was very influential as a teacher. Later, he emigrates to the United States. A lot of these teachers, because of how progressive it was, you can imagine how it had some run-ins with later when Nazism takes over in Germany. They had some issues, and so Elbers fled and came to the United States, as well as Walter Gropius, Mies van der Rohe, and some of the other artists that we'll talk about and teachers that we'll talk about today. So we talk about him again in a bit and what he does in the United States. This is his work, the work of his wife, Annie Elbers, and I mentioned too, he wrote this in a very important book, Interaction of Color, which we'll talk more about. But you can basically see this premise of this class that would tell students to just essentially play around with the materials, experiment with the materials, just play with basics like color and form, which was happening already in modernism. But it was like those students like Matisse and Picasso went to school, drew the nude model, and at some point on their own decided to abandon the model. And here we are at the Bauhaus that says, let's cut out the middleman, cut out the bullshit. Maybe we don't even have to draw from the nude model. Let's just jump straight to the goods and go right to teaching the fundamentals of color and design and form. And by the way, if you want to draw from the nude model, cool. We have a class for that too. But it's more about the form, the structure of the nude model. But we don't think it's essential. So I really think that it's important to consider the philosophy of these teachers. Another really important and influential teacher and an artist that we've talked about before is Paul Klee. Paul Klee is a Swiss artist, and he moves to Germany. He teaches at the Bauhaus. He was part of the German Expressionism movement, but also his work kind of incorporated elements of Cubism, but he was never ever just purely into abstraction. There was always still an interest in nature and things that were organic. He had this really interesting approach to teaching, and he wrote a book called The Pedagogical Sketchbook. That is, that there is sort of a rational way of creating art. You have to discover ways of making your art, and he was really interested in an individualistic way, sort of a visionary way of seeing art. In other words, that your idea of what art is unique to you. What my idea of art is and what I'm inspired to create is unique to me. And so you really foster that in teaching, which is true, I think, to an idea of finding out what you want to make. What is your voice as an artist? What is your style? Which ironically is kind of a modernist ideal, but Paul Klee kind of looks back at earlier artists to get that idea of, if we think about something like Romanticism, for instance, those artists. So he was never completely abstract. He had a lot of work that was still very much rooted in nature, such as this piece right here called Around the Fish. He used to draw on his students' drawings as they would work and say, he would draw an arrow and say, work on this area, or draw an arrow and say, this area needs a little bit more shading, whatever. And those arrows then started to creep into his work. Or he would draw on the chalkboard diagrams of how to understand color and form. And then next thing you know, those started to seep their way into his work as well. He had these series of black paintings with these weird kind of shapes and sometimes real imagery floating on those black backgrounds. And Klay's methods and theories had an affinity with what we call now automatic drawing or automatic writing. The kind of the first thing that comes to your mind, and the next thing, whether it makes sense or not, you draw that. And so the surrealists were heavily influenced. In a way, he's a prototypical surrealist artist. And later, the surrealist artists were inspired by Paul Klee, and they actually invited him to exhibit, even though he wasn't a surrealist, to exhibit his works alongside their works, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. So very, very influential in the idea of the individual. Interest in nature. Oh, and he also had this thing that he said that, Picasso had the same idea. Picasso said, we learn to draw, but children already know how to draw. Picasso said, I learned to draw, and then I had to unlearn how to draw and draw like a child again. Paul Klee felt the same way. He said children have a unique power to actually see, or artists that were outsider artists. And remember, Hitler in 1937 picked on Paul Klee and others and said their work looked like kids drew them or degenerates drew them, people who were mentally and physically handicapped. And Paul Klee says this is a plus. This is what's exciting about this artwork. And Hitler and others with the Degenerate Art Show in 1937 basically are picking on these artists for showing a different side of what art could be. One of my favorite quotes by Paul Klee is, "A line is a dot that went for a walk." I love that. And I think just that quote just really sums up his philosophy about art. It's as much as just putting the pen on the paper and letting it go for a walk and having fun with it, right? And enjoying the process. I think that really explains how his works physically manifest themselves. Later in his career, he was inspired by a trip to Egypt, and you can kind of see this pyramid in this image, and a mosaic almost of little dabs of color of paint. And this piece is called Ad Parnassum, which is derives from a musical counterpoint, meaning stairway to Parnassus, Parnassus was a mountain sacred to the Greek god Apollo and his muses. So here we see an interest in music, Greek mythology, and Egyptology as well wrapped up into one beautiful piece that just really, really sings. The other thing about Paul Klee's work is it's so hard to sum it up. Look at how different all of these pieces are. And it's like if I showed you 30 different pieces by Paul Klee, you might think that there are 30 pieces by 30 different artists as opposed to the singular vision of just one artist. But that's a strength, right? A solo show by Paul Klee almost looks like a group exhibition, and he was interested in that. Another very influential teacher at the Bauhaus was Kandinsky. Kandinsky had already been famous as a painter. Remember his innovations and his developments in abstraction. Generally thought as the first artist to explore abstraction. Vasily Kandinsky teaches at the Bauhaus after already been famous. He wrote the book concerning the spiritual in art in 1911 before teaching at the Bauhaus. And if we compare it to an earlier, remember he helped form Der Blue Rider. And if we looked at an earlier painting by Kandinsky, also called Composition, you can see how over the course of 10 years, boom, this is 1913. I guessed correctly. 10 years earlier, 1913, also called Composition. This one is Composition 7 in the book, and this is Composition 8. 10 years later, the very next series, the very next painting in this series, it becomes much more geometric, less expressionistic, much more inspired by the experiments going on in constructivism in Russia. Remember, Elizitsky and Kandinsky and Malevich are all very influential in early abstraction, and they're all Russian. And so here we see much more organized, fractals, planar, and he wrote another book as well called, thinking about Paul Klee's pedagogical sketchbook. Kandinsky attempts a more definitive use of here's how you arrange the elements of art, and his book is called Point and Line to Plane. And here we see all of these different two-dimensional planes in this composition. So he becomes a little more formal once he's teaching at the Bauhaus. But I love his work. It's very, very beautiful. You can still see that aspect of concerning the spiritual in art and this otherworldly kind of cosmic expression in his work. So he wrote the book, The Point and Line to Plane. Earlier, before he's at the Bauhaus, he writes this book concerning the spiritual in art and how art can be transformational and can have a revelation almost like a spiritual experience. So Kandinsky also taught at the Bauhaus. He returned to Germany in 1921 and started teaching in 1922 at the Bauhaus. A lot of these artists, he actually continued to teach the longest. The Bauhaus was closed in 1933, shut down by Hitler and the Nazis, and at that point Kandinsky had to leave. But this was a very progressive school, and you can see, oh my gosh, look, can't believe we wore the same shirt today. It's kind of funny. This is me checking out a Kandinsky in the Guggenheim in New York 2 summers ago. Love the museum, love this piece, love this painting. Several circles. Looks kind of different seeing it reproduced this way. Here it's like the black is emphasized in this reproduction, and the black becomes a little bit more matte or flat when you see it in person. Beautiful painting. Gunther Stolz was a influential early teacher in the Bauhaus as well. And when Gropius still was the director, he tried as much as he could to integrate and have men and women learning at the Bauhaus. Although, unfortunately, he still was a little bit sexist, a lot of it sexist, actually. And he said that he wanted not too much of a balance between male and female teachers. So he only allowed women to teach in the tapestry wing, which he said was more suitable for female students. Later, they laxened those rules a little bit, so this was early in the 20s. Later, in the late 20s, they start to allow women to study architecture as well. But he was actually, Walter Gropius was both interested in having women teach to allow, more, and there's female students as well, to allow a fairness and also an interest in, if you're reacting to modernism and what's going on in the world, you need multiple viewpoints. And I won't quite say it's diversity because that happens later once Bauhaus moves to the United States. But it is an opportunity to allow for various viewpoints. But it was still a sort of sheltered viewpoint, okay? So it was, Gunther Stolzel was teaching tapestries, teaching weaving in the fibers workshop, which was a very important workshop, but it was one that was sort of relegated mostly to women. And when the first Bauhaus building was built, Gunther Stolzel helped decorate with all of her weavings in there, as well as chair design by Marcel Breuer. This is an iconic chair. I love this. I want a Breuer armchair. But then when they built the building in Dessau, Stolzel decorated the walls and Breuer integrated the chairs. Just thinking about too, like Charles McIntosh with the arts and crafts movement, Frank Lloyd Wright in the United States. There's nothing too small in a building to consider from a design aspect. And so Bauhaus becomes very influential in terms of decorative design, but also thinking about like interior design, but also industrial design. And both of those aspects work side by side. So Marcel Breuer was really important in terms of the design aspects and kind of incorporating the visual aspects of modernism and extending that to chairs. Chairs don't have to look the same way. And this is influential too in industrial design, how it's taught in the United States now, is thinking about practicality and also that functionalism of Walter Gropius. So for instance, there might be a chair where you're sitting at an office and that has a particular purpose. There might be a chair at home when you're just chilling and you're trying to be relaxed. That should have a different type of purpose, right? So they should look different, they should act different. And so this is a kind of a major tenet in industrial design now, is kind of like an ergonomical way of considering how the chair kind of looks and fits and feels to the person who would be buying it. And I look at his work, and so this is from 1927, but yet it looks like it could be 2021. Am I right? It just looks very, very modern, slick. We even say maybe mid-century modern, which you think about mid-century modernism as 1950s, 1960s, and here we have the precedent of it, a prototype in the 1920s, way ahead of his time. Another teacher is Nam Gabao, and Gabao did these linear constructions, and he was Russian as well, so we see an interest in constructivism at the Bauhaus. And a practicality. He made huge monumental sculptures as well. There's one in Rotterdam that's like 5 stories tall and different, similar to the works of Moholy Nagy, where we see an interest in light and space and motion. This is interesting because this is lucite. It's basically like clear plastic, kind of a precursor to plexiglass. So lucite with nylon thread to create this really interesting texture. And actually one of the classes at Bauhaus was just called Materials and Texture. And it was kind of like Montessori. I don't know if anyone went to a Montessori school, but similar ideas of like play and do. It's one thing to kind of study what grasshoppers do from a book, but what if you actually go outside and you look at a grasshopper and you hold it, and it's kind of that aspect of play integrates into the Bauhaus as well. So I really like these ideas of materials, which would have been really important to understand how to make things, right? Mies van der Rohe is not quite the second, but the third director. So the rise of kind of the rise of its prominence in Weimar Republic, and then later as it starts to get some attention from the German government, they have to kind of watch what they do. Walter Gropius resigned in 1928, and he wanted Mies van der Rohe to replace him, to be his successor, but ultimately they put in place someone else, a guy named Meyer, M-E-Y-E-R. He was a Marxist. He rather focused on functional and socially responsible architecture that Walter Gropius and Mies van der Rohe were interested in, and more just kind of the aesthetics and how it looked, which is really different. It's so different than what Walter Gropius and Bauhaus was all about. So his tenure at the Bauhaus was really short-lived, and a few years later, Mies van der Rohe, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, becomes the new director of the Bauhaus in 1930. You also had the rise of Nazism at this time and unwanted attention on the Bauhaus, and later it completely gets shut down. And a lot of these artists had to flee for their lives. But Mies van der Rohe is a really important architect. I think you have to think about like how he started. First of all, he has some major influences on him. His dad was a mason. His dad was a bricklayer. So that inspired him. He gained a respect for craft skills, basic building skills, as a result of his father being a craftsperson. He studied under Peter Behrens. He worked with him for 3 years. And he was very influenced by the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright, which we can see in one of his drawings here, which basically becomes a really elongated prairie house like Roby House that Frank Lloyd Wright made in Chicago. And interestingly enough, Mies van der Rohe later goes to Chicago actually after he's ousted from Germany because of Hitler not appreciating the way that the Bauhaus, you can understand why this idea of equality and diverse perspectives would not jive well with Hitler, right? And he shut down the school. Also, the ideas of no hierarchies in terms of different art mediums. Hitler felt like painting and architecture should be the best, and sculpture. He commissioned huge sculptures of eagles and proud Aryan men out and kind of idealism. So he had an issue with abstraction and progressive and modernism being the key at Bauhaus. One of the most famous tenets of Mies van der Rohe is this idea that less is more, right? This famous saying, actually Louis Sullivan had started it, but Mies van der Rohe very much popularizes it. He's visionary. This was a skyscraper that was never built. It was a prototypical, it was a model for a glass skyscraper. It was constructed as just a small model. And it is very influential. And at the time, people were like, no one would want to live in this. And then boom, 30 years later, all skyscrapers do look like this. And even today, this would still look very much innovative. And you can see that curtain wall, the glass sheathing that is suspended by the floor above it, that Walter Gropius had invented and popularized. But Mies van der Rohe very much popularized this idea of less is more. And actually now, if you watch a lot of building shows about renovation, and if you watch, like Chip and Joanne, and they're talking about open space, right? Open concept. This really comes from Mies van der Rohe. Look at this space that he created. I love these mid-century modern looking chairs in here. Just a beautiful aesthetic that just looks timeless. It's hard to tell if this was built in 1921, 1929 for the Barcelona, Spain exposition. This was the German pavilion. It was later destroyed. It was later torn down, but it's been reconstructed in 1986 from photographs of the day. This is like Frank Lloyd Wright. We see this cantilevered space and this idea of mixing the outside with the inside. And I love this. This is a Bauhaus model and tenet as well, to have the outside floor, the outside ground connect to the inside floor and uninterrupted viewpoints, which I just love, which is all about open space, or what today we say in interior design is open concept, right? Basically, if there were teeny tiny rooms, you knock those down, you have sight lines throughout the space, more perspective, more view, more light, and more of a social space as well. I'm in the kitchen cooking, Carly's in the living room weaving, and we can have a conversation. We can still see each other, we can talk, and greeting guests, right? It's a much more open and inviting and warm space. Beautiful use of materials, which as the director of the Bauhaus, he's encouraging playing with different materials. And you can see this is an extension of Frank Lloyd Wright and a cantilevered plan and opening up. And look at, I love this, how the space continues on the outside. We see this in a very famous building later that he designs in Berlin, the new National Gallery, which I've been before. It's amazing. This is dedicated to sculpture, but it's as much about the building as it is about the sculptures that are inside. And you can see the marble and the granite on the outside is this one uninterrupted plane, and you can see it going all the way through the building and then exit on the other side as well. Beautiful use of space. And actually the library at Lyon College is very indebted to Mies van der Rohe, internationalism, and the Bauhaus. So if you stand outside the Mabie Simpson Library and you look at the brick, and then there's windows in the front that have glass curtain wall sheathing as well, you can see the brick is on the exact same level as the floor inside of the Mabie Simpson Library. Or when you're walking, I love the space, reading a magazine, I'll sometimes just chill, grab like a New American Paintings issue and sit in one of the chairs, and as people walk by, they're on the same level as you, and there's less of a distinction of what's inside versus what's outside because of this glass curtain wall, which is just like amazing. He moved to Chicago and he helped start a school that later became, it's kind of was like the new Bauhaus in Chicago. It later became the Illinois Institute of Technology, and he designed some of the buildings that are on that campus, an amazing campus. And one of my former students, Spencer Goff, who's an awesome human being, he graduated from Lyon College a few years ago, and he now is studying architecture at the Institute there in Chicago, where Mies van der Rohe started emigrated to the United States, started teaching after he left the Bauhaus. So there's this cool kind of connection there. And some of the Laszlo Moholy-Nagy also taught there, and a class that he started way back in like the 40s after he immigrated to the United States and was kicked out of Germany by Hitler. They went into Walter Gropius's studio and confiscated some of the stuff. They thought his teachings were too far out there. But one of the design courses that he taught at the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago is still taught to this day. And Spencer says it's a class that you can sign up for. It's basically like you just take a line and then you divide that line into parts. And then once you've had that line and that new line, you now divide that into a new part. So like all semester, you're doing basically this really, really simple compositional idea. But you look at it and it's like, okay, I don't know why, but this one definitely works, right? And this person maybe moved the line too far or made the line too thick, and it doesn't work for whatever reason. So it's this really interesting design question. And that was actually what the Bauhaus was all about, was creating problems. Not necessarily solutions, but problems. So if you create a problem and you think about different ways of solving it, that then is innovative, as opposed to starting with the solution and saying, here, students, I want you to already, here's the solution and I want you to get to that solution. Instead, here's a problem and see what you can do with the problem, and everyone's going to come up with different solutions, and they're probably all not going to work, but maybe one does, one's more valuable, one inspires skyscrapers, another one inspires graphic design, but it's all these very influential ways of thinking. Joseph Albers also emigrates to the United States after being ousted from the Bauhaus, flees for his life because of Hitler and the rise of Nazism. He first starts a very influential school in Asheville, North Carolina, called Black Mountain College. And remember that idea of the value in a variety of viewpoints? Black Mountain College, or the Black Mountain School in Asheville, North Carolina, becomes the first art school in the United States to intentionally integrate all ethnicities, black and white students, and becomes a very fertile testing ground and very influential. Joseph Albers taught some really, really important artists, first at the Black Mountain College in Asheville, North Carolina. Eventually, it falls apart. It was very much based on the premise of the Bauhaus. And then later, he teaches at Yale. Remember that idea that I said about certain problems? He created this series of paintings, which are just beautiful. I love these works. And they're called Homage to the Square. But they're not quite, there's a little asymmetry to them. They're not quite, they're symmetrical left and right, but they're not symmetrical top and bottom. The square isn't centered. If you look at this gray band here, it's of a certain thickness. He doubles it on the sides and triples it on the top, right? So it creates this really interesting pace or spacing or rhythm. And he wrote this great book that I use. It's like the Bible for 2D design, called The Interaction of Color. And if you ever take a 2D design class with me, I didn't do it this last time because of the pandemic, but if you take 2D design with me, I do a great series of studies called Interaction of Color, very much based on Albers' teaching, where you try to make, first of all, two different colors look like three, or three colors look like two, or three colors look like four. And it's similar to this idea of the homage to the square, where you're making one color, like say bluish green, we can change what it's surrounded by to make it look green over here or blue over here. Really influential teachings on the foundations of how to teach art. And actually, one of Joseph Albers' students was this guy, Bill Itter, which I had intended to include more images and I forgot. But Bill Itter was Joseph Elber's student at Yale, and Bill Itter was my teacher and my mentor at Indiana University. So in a way, I feel like, you know, I'm the grandchild of Joseph Albers and his teachings because I'm a follower of Albers and Bill Itter. And in a way, when I teach 2D design, it kind of makes you all the great grandchildren of Joseph Albers. So I have a close affinity to his ideas. I love his work and his teachings. But I don't think it just ends here because he has so many different variations of this homage to the square. And I think they're beautiful, but they're interesting for what they do physically, phenomenology, right? Like that the color can create a certain vibration and not necessarily that it's an end in its own, that it can create experimentation and lead you to other ideas. This was my professor, Bill Itter. This is a huge piece, but you can see the influence of Cubism in Bill Itter's work. You can also see the influence of Joseph Albers, and Bill Itter's wife, Diane, was she's no longer living. She unfortunately succumbed to cancer at a pretty young age. She is world famous, and her pieces are in museums across the world. One of her pieces is in the Smithsonian. She did weavings. I feel like Bill Itter and Diane Itter are like the Joseph and Ani Albers of the United States. So Bill Itter went to Yale. He later teaches at Indiana University. I didn't have him as a professor, but as a graduate student, he was my mentor. He taught me how to teach two-dimensional design because he was the director of foundations. And so basically, I studied with him to be able to teach that class. He was my mentor, my supervisor. And so essentially, he had us meet the summer before I taught the class, and I did all of his assignments. I did all the Albers assignments, and then kind of tweak them and make them my own, of course. But I'm very indebted to his teaching. One of the things and I just want to focus on this for a second. One of the things that's really cool about Bill Itter, too, is he taught at Indiana University for 30-some years. He retired. He became professor emeritus, which is a status that they give to professors that have gone above and beyond and have been really dedicated to the institution. On a really shoestring budget, his wife and him collected African art. Just like Matisse and Picasso were influenced by African art, Bill Itter was as well, and you can see it in his work. He collected about 500 African objects over the course of his teaching for 30 years. He was buying them for $100 here, $300 there. They are now worth over $4 million. What does he do? He gifts them to the museum at the Indiana University Art Museum. I'll show you a quick picture of this because I think it's pretty cool. So what he bought, little by little, here he is, Bill Itter. What he collects little by little, you can see, just amazing. I mean, I went over to dinner for his house, and this was the dinner table. You have to like eat on your lap because it's just the whole house was surrounded and filled with these artifacts from Africa. But he started collecting them when not many people were collecting them in the 60s and the 70s. He did it for 30 or 40 years. He was spending hundreds of dollars on these on a very modest professor's salary. And he later gifts them to the Indiana University Art Museum, and they're worth over $4 million. They had to build an entire new wing to the museum. His collection was so large. Pretty cool guy, and this is something that I say all the time. I truly believe it. It's made my life so meaningful, but I always say art is worth pursuing, and I always say a life dedicated to art is a life that's worth living, right? And you can really see that with the work of Bill Itter. I mean, it's just a testimony to this idea that a life that's dedicated to art is a life that's worth giving, and it gives your life meaning, but it gives other people's life meaning too. You studying art, you making art as an artist, you're contributing to society, and you're contributing to society in a positive and meaningful way. What is your piece going to be? Look at Bill Itter's legacy. Look at what he's given back to the community from collecting African art and now donating it to the Indiana University. He's enriched my life. He's taught me so many things. That's why when I go to a museum and I see a Kandinsky piece or an Albers piece, boom, I got to do a selfie with it. Or Mark Rothko, for instance, right? It's like what's your life dedicated to? And for me, like I said, a life dedicated to art is a life worth living. I'm going to end you on that. Peace. See y'all.